Good afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to attend this session. I'm looking forward to it. It's good to be back in Miami at S4. This is my second S4, and so far so good. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. By way of brief introduction, my name is Dave Weinstein. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Claroty. I'm going to talk a little bit about Claroty, but more about kind of our vision, some of our observations with respect to the changing landscape and the role of the CISO as it relates to OT security. Quick show of hands, how many, if any, CISOs do we have in the room? Just a couple, okay. So congratulations, you're now in charge of OT security. So your world just got a whole lot more complicated. I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who used to be a CIO and a CISO as well. I previously served as the state CIO and before that the state CISO for the great state of New Jersey. And I was often asked, what keeps you up at night, right? It's like the most cliched question. Every security practitioner or executive gets asked that question on a regular basis. And my answer was always the same, which is that I have zero visibility into my OT environment, right? So CISOs are kind of in this precarious position, increasingly so, with respect to having all of the responsibility, yet very little of the visibility and control over this environment, which is an increasingly consequential one, not just from a safety perspective, but also from a business perspective as it relates to operational downtime. So for us, when we talk about OT security, given how we've seen this shift from the plant floor to the C-suite, really from a governance perspective. By the way, it's one that has kind of mirrored many of the technological shifts that have taken place with the convergence of OT and IT. We talk about it in the context of risk management, right? Risk management is a top security initiative for 2020. Gartner has talked about it, all the analysts are seeing it, and it really comes down to two things. You have attacks in your OT production environment, and then you have the potential for negative impact on the business. And that negative impact is measured, of course, along a variety of different lines. The first is financial, the second is reputational, and the third is loss of data and intellectual property. Now, these are always kind of the primary considerations that CISOs are taking into account when they build and manage an information security and a risk management program at the enterprise level. And it's these very same factors that are influencing decisions on the OT side of the house too. So when we talk about attacks in OT production environments, right, the things that kind of kick off most of our conversations with CISOs, they come in a few different varieties, right? So you have your targeted OT attacks, and thankfully we've seen these types of attacks, at least over the last year, decrease in frequency. And then you have your non-targeted attacks, which are really kind of the more prevalent types of attacks, and those that relate more to this intersection of IT and OT, right? So when you have commodity malware, for example, ransomware in many cases, that is propagating from the IT side of the house and all of a sudden finds its way into the OT environment, then you kind of come to this level of awareness that in fact these two technological ecosystems have converged, and so too does the governance model. And that's what leads to kind of this unified framework around how organizations manage risk in environments that are increasingly converged from an IT and an OT perspective. So the problem is really challenging for CISOs. First of all, and I say this as somebody who came out of the IT infrastructure world, CISOs typically don't understand the OT environment because they've operated in the IT world for most of their career, right? Again, this is how I experienced the same thing, and one of my biggest fears as a CISO with a very IT-centric portfolio was that I had no visibility into my OT risk. So there's a number of challenges that they're dealing with right off the bat, right at the outset, that they have to overcome. The first is there is no risk baseline, right? The last speaker talked a little bit about establishing a baseline of communications at a very technical level, and this is really important, right? First, you have to establish visibility. You have to see what assets you have on your network, and then at a very granular level, you have to understand how those assets are communicating between and among each other. But then you have to take that up a notch, and you have to understand how that translates to risk, right? And most organizations that are just inheriting this problem and undergoing this governance shift in which the CISO now has responsibility for OT security in some fashion, lack that baseline. The second is they are naturally unfamiliar with the types of devices and protocols, right? And this is something I dealt with myself. I would go take an inventory of my OT devices, and inevitably, while many of them would be familiar, I'd come across devices that I had never seen before or protocols that I wasn't accustomed to dealing with. This is a very common challenge. Another is the kind of inherent poor ICS security that is taking place in these environments. And what I mean by that is it's typically a product of the legacy architecture that populates most of these networks, right? This is hardly an indictment of the ICS manufacturers and vendors themselves. It's simply the reality that the shelf life of these devices, as everyone knows, can be up to 35 years. And these were designed for a different time and place, a time and place where the level of connectivity was at a fraction of what it is today. And therefore, things like basic authentication, basic encryption were just not in place. So again, CISOs are walking into this environment, and they're learning that not only are their networks more exposed than ever, but the assets themselves are exposed and inherently insecure in many places. Obviously, and this was discussed at length in the last talk, you can't just throw IT tools in OT environments, right? At a minimum, it's not going to work. The worst case scenario is it actually breaks something, right? So the preference, the knee-jerk preference, if you will, of a CISO and IT security practitioners is just to use the existing tool set that you already have. After all, organizations have made significant investments in their IT security technology stack, and wouldn't it be nice if that could just be applied to the OT side of the house? Of course, we all know that is not the case. So you're now having to reconcile the fact that you've made these really significant investments, but they cannot be applied in many cases to reducing risk on the OT side of the house. The dependency from a human resource perspective is also really critical, right? So CISOs are accustomed to their enterprise kind of information security program, which incorporates elements of an IT SOC and traditional analytical roles, the folks who are doing patch management, the folks who are doing vulnerability management, the infrastructure people. But without the folks who actually understand the OT environments, who understand the protocols, who know how these devices are behaving, are supposed to behave, you cannot validate the utility of any tools within your environment, much less utilize them in an efficient and effective manner. So there is a critical dependency on existing OT staff as it relates to managing OT risk. Obviously, limited connectivity oftentimes makes things very difficult from a maintenance and even an implementation perspective. And then, of course, onerous change control procedures as well can be, to put put it lightly, a headache for CISOs who are taking on this new challenge. So we kind of looked at that environment and said, okay, these are all the challenges, the headaches, the pain points that CISOs are dealing with. And keep in mind, they are receiving this mandate in many cases from on high. So either they've experienced an unfortunate incident, maybe they were collateral damage, maybe they were targeted, maybe they had an IT audit or an OT audit, and the board simply said, tag, you're it. So now they're forced to actually do something about this. And we evaluated all those pain points, and we decided that in order to really begin a journey and continue that journey to maturity from an OT security perspective, you need to have a solution that is credible, efficient, and non-disruptive, right? Those are three really intentional words to describe what you need, not just in a technology, but in a service provider with respect to OT security and OT risk management, if you're going to treat it as a risk management issue, right? And this is where we kind of depart from the notion of just checking a box from a compliance perspective or dealing with one discipline or one domain of OT security versus providing a holistic solution that addresses all the key cybersecurity domains that CISOs are accustomed to addressing on the IT side of the house. So what does credible, efficient, non-disruptive mean? Credible means you need to be able to implement security controls consistent with IT security controls and best practices. Right? So you essentially, just as the ecosystem is converging, just as the threat actors are converging, you need to have a defensive posture, a risk management posture that mirrors what is on the IT security side. Because if you're going to scale this across a large organization, you need to have the IT and the OT people working together. And for that to happen, they need to speak the same language and they need to be working on the same sheet of music. So this credibility is really important, particularly given how critical, as I said earlier, the OT staff is, what a critical dependency they are to an effective implementation of a security solution on the OT side of the house. It needs to be efficient. If you can't integrate into existing people, process, and technology, then it's going to be a really, really long road to that OT security. I alluded to the fact, and we'll talk more about this later, that CISOs have made significant investments, organizations have made significant investments on the IT security side of the house from a technology perspective, from a human capital perspective, and also from a process perspective as it relates to the security operations, security policies that exist within the organization. If you cannot plug into that, then you're really going to extend not just the time, but the cost of implementing a solution and ultimately reaching that level of maturity that's going to start bringing down your risk from the OT side of the house. And then finally, last but not least, the solution, the service has to be non-disruptive. And non-disruptive is actually measured in a couple ways. The most obvious is that it can't bring down production, right? You have to have a principle of do no harm first and foremost. But it also can't be disruptive to the existing IT security operations that are critical to protecting the corporate network or the business network, right? Because again, you're going to have to rely on those resources to implement the solution and ultimately implement the service down the road. So those are what we arrived at in terms of what you need in a solution and a solution provider in order to address some of those key pain points. So in case you're unfamiliar with Claroty, I'll just talk a little bit about us. We were founded in 2015. We operated in stealth mode for a couple years and went to market in 2016. Since then, we've raised $100 million in funding, And a vast majority of that has gone into our product development. And most of our product development focus has been on alleviating and addressing, quite frankly, many of the pain points that I just talked about. We have we're very fortunate to have a really marquee syndicate of investors, organizations like Temasek Holdings out of Singapore, Team 8 out of New York and Tel Aviv, Bessemer Venture Partners out of California. We're also extremely proud to call Rockwell, Siemens, and Schneider Electric as investors as well. We also consider them customers and go-to-market partners. So not only did they provide a major technical validation of our product, but they are also users of our product and go-to-market partners. And of course, we have a number of strategic resellers and integrators. But our focus as a company, and we were born in the OT space, right? And we've actually gone through a bit of an evolution since 2015 when we were founded, as the market has shifted and migrated to this point where CISOs and the OT floor, the folks who are actually owning and operating these process control devices and responsible for reliability and production uptime, those two governance models, those two cultures are converging, right? Which is why, as I said, $100 million in funding, so much of that has gone to addressing the pain points and the requirements of our key stakeholders, of CISOs and others, but also tailoring the user experience to the preferences of what is actually a really diverse pool of end users. Folks that operate in an enterprise level SOC, folks that are sitting on the plant floor, and in many cases, maybe consuming our feed or our data and our insights through another feed. At the end of the day, it's really about simplifying OT risk management, right? And this is what it boils down to. You're talking about, in many cases, really mature, large enterprises from an enterprise information security program. And now all of a sudden, you have this new OT issue, right? So if you're going to talk about fast time to value, low barriers to adoption, then it needs to be simplified. And that has been our focus. We talked about the risk assessment and baselining. The first thing you need to do before you can even get that level of visibility that you need to understand what's happening on your network is you need to understand what your key gaps are. And you need to prioritize remediation of those key gaps. Then, of course, it's all about visibility, understanding what's on your network and how those devices are communicating with each other. We also focus a lot on addressing key observables from the threat environment. So we have the benefit of being in production environments in about 30 countries on 6 continents across over 15 verticals. And what that provides us, among other things, is keen insights into how actors are manipulating these networks to achieve a certain desired effect. Whether that desired effect be disruptive in nature, whether it be destructive in nature, or whether it's more of kind of a reconnaissance and information gathering operation. So based on those insights, based on that data, we tailor our detection engines accordingly. We tailor our behavioral analysis algorithms accordingly and provide our end users with the context that they need to ultimately action the information that's coming into their SOC or coming into their GUI, however the use case is tailored. And that is really a big part of what simplifying OT risk management means, especially if your end user consumer is somebody on the IT side of the house, right? Somebody who comes from an IT infrastructure, an IT security analyst background, may not understand what a configuration download means, or may not understand this protocol or that PLC. You really have to translate the OT syntax, if you will, into a nomenclature and a vernacular that IT security practitioners can understand. That's also a really, really critical element of what it means to simplify OT risk management. So I won't spend too much time on this, but we talked a little bit about how we kind of reconcile the way IT practitioners think about security with what's happening on the OT side and vice versa. Starts with asset visibility. Vulnerability management is key. Now, vulnerability management on the OT side of the house is not what it is on the IT side of the house. It's easy to say that PLC is vulnerable and kind of just dump a list of known vulnerabilities on your owners and operators and say, go ahead, patch those in 10 or 15 days. Of course, that's not practical in an industrial environment. That's not practical on most OT networks. So you need to be able to provide the context, the risk associated with each of those vulnerabilities, so that end users can make informed, risk-based decisions about how they go about patch management, whether it be actually implementing the patch or implementing compensating controls to mitigate the risk associated with vulnerabilities on the OT network. We focus on network zoning and segmentation. This is all about reducing the cost and the time of segmenting networks. Obviously, one of the biggest risks that we see in OT environments and on OT networks, and it's more prevalent in some sectors than others, is just the flat network, right? And this exposes these networks to the types of collateral damage attacks, sometimes involving commodity malware, that relatively easily and under the right circumstances can bring a plant down just by causing a loss of view incident, in a production facility. Obviously, our bread and butter is with advanced threat detection. I talked about how we go about curating signatures and tuning our detection engines to detect not just what has been reported or publicly disclosed, but how actors are using the native functions of OT devices in order to manipulate the control process, right? This is the key kind of attribute of most targeted OT attacks, some of which involve very little to no malware at the latter stages of the attack life cycle. Secure remote access is a topic that comes up routinely with CISOs, especially those in environments where they depend on third parties and remote employees for very legitimate business purposes. Understanding those connections and just gaining visibility and having the ability to not just monitor but also control and ultimately audit those connections is critical to risk management. And then, of course, you can't do this once and be done. It's not a one and done exercise. It's really about ongoing risk assessment to make sure that your posture is not just compliant with the latest best practice and standards and controls, but suited for the evolving threat landscape, which, as many of you know, is changing almost on a daily basis. This is our three-tier architecture. Is just kind of an example. In the interest of time, I'll move quickly through this, but we typically connect via a spam port on a switch in order to copy all the traffic and perform our collection that way. We have other collection capabilities above and beyond passive. While passive is always a great starting point, sometimes it's necessary to use active querying on a very targeted and tailored basis to extract asset information. We can also offline parse configuration database files, which is a really useful way of collecting data in networks that are truly or more air-gapped than others, and frequently backed up. And then finally, and this gets to an earlier point about the importance of integration, the importance of lowering those barriers to entry and kind of seamlessly allowing the IT security and the OT security to converge in the interest of risk management. You have to be able to talk with your existing technology stack. For us, this is a competitive advantage, but my prediction, quite frankly, is if you do not have an integration ecosystem like this moving forward, you simply won't be able to play. It's almost going to be, in my opinion, a prerequisite because of how invested so many end users are in this ecosystem that you see here. And then, of course, rapid deployment, low maintenance is critical. These are all things that CISOs care about on the IT infrastructure side of the house. And the same is true on the OT side of the house. It has to be low touch. You have to be able to give the owners and operators the tools that they need to be able to deploy the technology on their own, to be able to maintain it if need be on their own. We've got some really exciting things coming out with respect to the cloud that's going to be monumental, quite frankly, in terms of reducing the total cost of ownership, but also increasing the speed of deployment and reducing the amount of maintenance that's required. So the cloud is a real big part of our story moving forward in terms of meeting the requirements, again, addressing the pain points, but also tailoring our capabilities to the preferences of our end users. And then, of course, monitoring proactively the health of the solution, just as you would any other solution in your environment. So again, just in closing, this is how we think about it. It's all in the interest of simplifying OT risk management, recognizing that there are so many challenges that are facing CISOs in particular who are walking into this environment with a whole host of challenges ahead of them. People challenges, process challenges, technology challenges. They need a solution provider that's simple, easy to use, brings value fast, and has a low cost of ownership. And that's been our focus for some time now, and increasingly so will be in the future. So with that, I have 30 seconds. Are there any pressing questions I can address? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was the partners that we work with and how it's adding value to the end user. So we work with a variety of partners for the purpose of making our solution more scalable, right? And getting it deployed quicker. So if a certain customer is accustomed to working with a certain partner, we want to make sure that we also work with that partner because there's existing relationships. So really, it's all about scaling the deployment. In the case of the automation vendors, again, we really value that partnership. More so, not only was it a major technical validation for us, but it's been extremely useful in our go-to-market and getting the solution out there across the world.